Good afternoon. This panel is entitled The Day After, Future of Israeli-Palestinian Relations. The hour we just spent with former Prime Minister Olmert is remarkable in many ways and a very appropriate entry to this panel, which for some of us, maybe for all of us, the title leaves no doubt about its main session, which is really uncertainty about the relationship between what the various communities aspire to and the question of whether that aspiration is achievable. And relying on what diplomats and military leaders often refer to as lessons learned, though it's often used in the policy world, may be less helpful in the situation today. The situation facing Israelis and Palestinians is unlike in past decades, and it's unlikely that the scholarship of researchers who've looked at post-conflict scenarios, comparative cases of how wars end, it's unlikely that we may get a lot of useful information in the current circumstances. I suspect that the day after will have very different meaning for Palestinians than for Israelis. And within each of those communities, there are probably, in fact, we know there are stark divisions of understanding and preferences. Each of our panelists comes to this topic with deep experience, but from somewhat different life experiences and perspectives. Our hope is, indeed our expectation, is that collectively they will help us set the stage for a thorough and rigorous discussion about this fundamental question of the future of Israeli-Palestinian relations. To the extent that the gap is great, then how best to resolve it? What practical factors need to be addressed? And how will they be addressed? Who and what are the probable spoilers to achieve the preferred future? And can they be impeded if not denied? What could or should be the roles of external actors in facilitating and verifying the transition from a kinetic conflict embedded in harsh demographic realities between asymmetric protagonists to a more hopeful future of a stable and progressive peace? Ehud Olmert left us with a statement that in the 50 years in which he's been so active, he remains optimistic. Perhaps, and hopefully our panelists can shed some sense of optimism about the future of Israel-Palestine issues. Hypothesizing about the future is not a very comfortable exercise. It's often done easily, often without sufficient thought and evidence. But for any of us with policy experience, we recognize the need to think through scenarios, evaluate options, assess operational requirements, and link all of those to practical, tactical decisions that should contribute to achieving strategic goals. So then what are the strategic goals? If end of violence, the desire for peace, stability, and economic well-being are those strategic goals, then moving beyond the rhetorical to the hard practicalities of not only what the day after likely will be, but what is needed to move forwards towards an aspirational future for both peoples. Certainly, we've already heard comments that simply the declaration of recognizing a Palestinian state is insufficient. So in that context, the presence of religious and/or national extremism means that preferred outcomes are likely to be highly contested within as well as between Israeli and Palestinian societies. Is that where the spoilers are embedded? Is that what will impede anything moving beyond the history we've recently seen? Will those internal divisions serve as the spoilers that impede a hopeful future of both peoples? So now let's turn to our panel. What I'd like to do is first invite the two speakers who are on Zoom to provide some thoughts on those kinds of issues that I'd shared with them in an earlier email. And I suggested they take 7 to 10 minutes. And then I'll turn to our two speakers here in front of us on the panel. And then I'm going to invite our panelists to engage one another to see if there are issues that they profoundly concur or deeply disagree with. And then should there be time, hopefully we will have an opportunity to take questions from the floor. So let me welcome the four panelists. I'm sorry that the two on Zoom can't be with us in person. Let me first invite Grace Wormenbo, the former director, Near East, Office of the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, and an adjunct professor at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, to take the so-called floor, please.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for kicking it off with me. I want to start with just offering my thanks to Eunice, Fiona, and the team for inviting me to this year's conference. I also want to thank Professor David DeWitt for moderating this conversation. I'm joining you from Sarajevo, a city with its own ghosts and war scars, which have led me to think a lot about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the day after, which has very much been a question, I think, that's been relevant now for decades. It's an honor to follow the distinguished panel that preceded us. I got to follow former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert's remarks, and I'll just caution you that my opening remarks will probably not be as optimistic as the tone that was set in that session. I will also try to answer Professor DeWitt's prompts on the day after and the future of Israeli-Palestinian relations. But with that said, one of the inherent difficulties with the question and the day after is that the conflict is very much ongoing, if not worsening by the day. And I'd say that this is true both in Gaza and in the West Bank. In Gaza, Israel has been fighting an almost 2-year war to displace Hamas. It recently restarted an offensive titled Gideon Cheret 2, or B in Hebrew. And the war, as I'm sure you all are all aware, has caused almost total destruction of Gaza, including destruction of critical infrastructure, has led to over 60,000 deaths and over 150,000 injured, though those are probably conservative estimates, and also has led to widespread displacement and famine among the civilians. And in the West Bank, which doesn't always receive the attention that I think is warranted, the security situation and economic situation has further declined, certainly in the aftermath of the October 7 attacks. And the PA, which is already unpopular, and Ehud Olmert commented a little bit on this, continues to be challenged from a legitimacy point of view, right at a time when there are international efforts to recognize and move forward on Palestinian statehood. Then I would also add that the two main actors, from my perspective, who have the ability to influence the current trajectory of conflict, have not taken concrete steps to do so. And we can get a little bit into the why of that in the Q&A and in the discussion. But the first is, of course, Netanyahu, who, from my perspective, appears to be increasingly isolated in his decision making, and in many ways appears more willing to go against the advice of his own cabinet and senior security officials, including people like Eyal Zamir, the IDF chief of staff, who quite clearly opposed the latest Gaza offensive. And then from the U.S. perspective, Trump, I think at the start of Trump's second term, there was a kind of an interesting meeting of the minds between neo-isolationists and anti-war progressives, hoping that America might, based on the idea of America first, lead to kind of a reevaluation of U.S. support, both militarily and rhetorically, on Gaza and broader regional actions. And that really hasn't happened to date. Then I'll also note that when thinking about the future of relations, there appears to be a little bit of a tendency for somewhat reductionist thinking. And I have two specific points I want to mention here. And the first is a misconception, in my view, that all problems inherently lead to Netanyahu. And for those of you who read the New York Times, there was an interesting op-ed by the former Minister of Defense and October 7 War Minister, Benny Gantz. And in this article, he reminded readers that last year, the Knesset overwhelmingly passed a declaration proclaiming that Israel would continue to reject a Palestinian state, and that such action following October 7th would be rewarding or tantamount to rewarding terrorism. And I think, this narrative continues today, as seen at the United Nations as well. And I would add also that these views broadly reflect recent domestic polling in Israel. Only about 20% of Israelis believe that peaceful coexistence is currently possible, and 50% now say that the two-state solution is not possible. And that's according to recent Pew surveys. And another survey recently conducted by Tel Aviv University found that only 10% of Israelis believe that negotiation will lead to peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And I will also note that 90% of Jewish Israelis, according to this poll, supported annexation of the occupied territories. Finally, on the point of domestic politics, it's also worth noting the expected national elections in Israel, which are slated to happen in 2026, and in the past have sometimes been viewed as a case to kind of reset relations with the Palestinians. And again, I'd say, according to recent polling, Bennett's newly formed party pulled ahead of Likud and stands a chance to form a coalition with existing opposition parties. And for those of you who've been following Bennett, Bennett is not a stranger to Israeli politics, and he served as a prime minister a few years ago. And again, I would just add, polling on pre-election polling needs to be taken with a grain of salt, but I just wanted to kind of provide a little bit of an indication of what the future might be of Israeli politics. Now, past isn't always prologue, but Bennett's stance on the PA file, I think, leaves fairly little room for those hoping for much progress or actual realization of a two-state solution or a quick end to the war in Gaza. In terms of his stance on Gaza, Bennett has been very critical of Netanyahu's handling of the war, publicly so, but this does not necessarily mean that he's in favor of reaching some sort of a détente with Hamas. And in a recent interview, one of the first he's done in many years, he actually said that under his leadership, the IDF would deploy the force necessary to fully eradicate Hamas, in contrast to what, in his opinion, Netanyahu has done. And then with regard to the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the question of statehood, excuse me, Bennett has described himself as being more right-wing than Netanyahu in the past and has vocally opposed the creation of a Palestinian state. He has also, in the past, supported annexation of Area C of the West Bank, where the majority of Israeli settlements currently are. And this brings me to my second point regarding the point of reductionist or somewhat wishful thinking of the future. Excuse me. I come here with a cold. So, and those are the facts on the ground. You mentioned it a little bit in your opening remarks, Professor David, on the recognition of the Palestinian state and what it means. But the reality is that world leaders can recognize a theoretical Palestinian state, but in reality, there's less and less to recognize every day. And for those of you who read Haaretz, there's a columnist, a veteran columnist there called Gidon Levy, who said it very aptly, I think, in a recent column stating, at no point in time has the dream of a state seemed more disconnected from the reality on the ground. And I think this is also captured by the fact that as the PA president accepts recognition from new countries, including two members of the Security Council with veto votes, he did it from Zoom, as more of the West Bank is being taken over by Israel. Finally, I'm running a little bit of overtime here. But before I conclude my opening remarks, I do want to highlight two longer term questions that potentially could change the direction of the conflict. Excuse me. The first has to do with the U.S. domestic outlook on conflict and its potential impact on the U.S.-Israeli relationship. And the big question here is really, does U.S. politics move more in line with public sentiment? As you are, I'm sure, undoubtedly aware, negative attitudes among the U.S. public towards the Gaza war and Israel more generally have been on the rise for some time. And while it's clear that those changes are more pronounced among Democrats and independents, you're also seeing movement, particularly among younger Republicans, regarding their support for Israel, which appears to be on a downward trajectory. And I'll just note here that even if foreign policy is not necessarily a key voting issue, both parties will need to reckon with these changes at some point in time. And the other question, which is very much tantamount to a future as well, is, and which will also depend on how the U.S. changes its stance, or if it does, concerns Israel's willingness and ability to face growing international isolation from an economic, political, and military perspective. I just saw a story indicating that Netanyahu's plane to the UN, to New York, went around Europe, which is interesting given the ICC charges. And I'll just also note, in prior years, I wrote quite a few pieces on how Netanyahu, as both foreign minister and as prime minister, very much focused on international integration and normalization. And this was not just true across the Arab world, but also in South Africa, in Africa and Southeast Asia. And this has clearly come to a halt, with some countries challenging pre-established levels of engagement and not moving forward on normalization, as is the case with Saudi Arabia. Now, regarding military and economic isolation, and I'll end here, in a speech last week in response to the threat by the EU to suspend its free trade agreement, Netanyahu declared that the economy would have autarkic features to shield from boycotts. Now, later, after he got quite a bit of negative feedback from economic industries in Israel, he clarified that this was about the defense industry. But the question really is about strategic autonomy, particularly on the military front. This has been a question that's been raised, that Netanyahu has raised in the past, and that Israelis have raised in the past. But it is one to, I think, watch in future years. And I'll just end there, and thank you again for having me.
Thanks so much. Let me now turn to Daniel Levy, President of the U.S. Middle East Project and former advisor to the government of Israel. Thank you very much for joining us. Sorry you can't be here with us in person.
I'm also sorry, David, and thank you for inviting and allowing me to participate virtually like this. I probably haven't set up the lighting where I am the best, but everywhere else in this hotel room in New York was a bit more dark. So I will move swiftly on from that. I regret not being able to hear the comments of former Prime Minister Olmert. I didn't realize that was an option, Grace. So well done on you. But I do want to pick up on some of the themes that Grace introduced. And where I have to begin is in two places. First of all, not to repeat the failures that got us here. Not to think that if we could just go back to October 6th, of course, for those whose lives have been lost and upended, that would be true. But as a political premise, the idea that going back to October 6th would somehow be a place that's a good place to be. October 6th is what brought October 7th. October 6th meant every day without predictability, under occupation for Palestinians, living in that reality, living with permanent insecurity. It was a quite normal day for Israelis, but I would argue that Israelis weren't building a future that can ultimately be viable for them either. So, and Mohammed's there with you, so I don't need to belabor this point. But if you were a Palestinian who had grown up under almost permanent siege and blockade, you were going into high school having lived under that blockade. If you'd been born when the blockade was introduced in 2006, in October 2023, you were about to complete school. And Israel during that blockade, and I want people to internalize what I'm about to say here. We have this information through an Israeli NGO, Gisha, which had a Freedom of Information Act request. The information came out. I doubt that would actually be true today. You wouldn't be able to get this information. But during that blockade, Israel calculated what was the calorie intake, what was the calorific intake that had to be allowed into Gaza in terms of food to keep the people at subsistence level, just above starvation. And I would argue that tells you everything you need to know about not going back, because it was just a short step from knowing how many calories would keep people just above starvation to imposing what we see today, which is starvation. And the other thing that one, of course, I would argue at least, has to start such a conversation with is one has to now be focused like a laser on ending the killing, ending the daily slaughter. I mean, it's dozens of Palestinians every day. So we can't talk about a day after, really. Until we put a stop to that, there are war crimes being enacted every day. There is an ICJ ruling on a genocide case brought by South Africa from January 2024. The International Court of Justice ruled on urgent provisional measures to avoid violations of the Genocide Convention, a case still being heard, which was summarily ignored by Israel, and things have only got worse since then. There are, of course, ICC arrest warrants for war crimes. There is now a UN Commission of Inquiry finding of genocide to join all those other genocides, to join all those other findings. So really, where we should be is how do we stop what is being done? In addition, regionally, I believe we have a Qatari speaker on the panel, and that's very timely in terms of the sovereignty of 6 other states having been violated by Israel in just the last few weeks. If I were to go to the next step, I would say, unless one puts a stop to this, for many, many people, and perhaps, and this seems to be the intention, that for the Palestinians collectively, there is no day after. By the way, I would also again argue this behooves very badly for Israel. I think this kind of hubristic overreach will not deliver ultimately security to Israelis. I also believe that Israel is a society that is fragmented, that does, and I apologize for the background noises, that does not have a huge level of resilience. It's tapped into a lot of that. And I would argue that one of the things that is not, but probably should be on the agenda when we think about the day after, is we do need to ask questions about accountability. We shouldn't simply say we move on. The people responsible for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, for crimes of genocide, should not just have the page turned and it's all okay. And that goes way deeper, and Grace implied this in her comments, than one Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. We have heard the term de-radicalization applied so many times to Palestinians, their textbooks, etc. And of course, Hamas and those other militant groups conducted violations of international law of their own on October 7th, following decades of Israeli illegal actions and after that, subsequently, what Israel has done. But de-radicalization, however we go about it, is something that is front and center of any attempt to think about Israeli society today, unfortunately. And the other thing we should at least put on the table, even if it's just initially as something to make a point and put that Israeli side on the back foot, is why should we assume that Gulf Arab states should pay for the destruction that Israel has enacted? That's it. It's almost the unspoken assumption, oh, those Gulf Arabs will come in and pay for it all. Why? Who caused the destruction? I don't remember these being Qatari, Saudi, Emirati. Planes, drones, artillery, destroying every school, hospital, the residential buildings in Gaza. And that should squarely be on the agenda. We talk about it like that in other places. Look, if I go one level deeper to the Israeli views on the day after, they do not make for happy reading. And in this respect, I salute the courage and the optimism of former Prime Minister Olmert. And I wish, I don't say this in any kind of a belittling fashion, I wish he were not so much of an outlier. The op-ed in the New York Times by one of the supposed opposition leaders, Mr. Gantz, that Grace referred to, is very important reading because it dispels this myth that the problem is Netanyahu. The problem, as was mentioned by Grace, goes much deeper. And one of the biggest disinformation components that we have been subjected to for almost 2 years now is as if the Israeli position is, if Hamas gave back the hostages, which they should, of course, and if Hamas disarmed, which is a far more thorny question, then everything could be okay. Netanyahu keeps telling us he has 5 conditions, one of which is no Palestinian governance of any variety that we would recognize as being Palestinian. Another is Israel will stay there in charge of security. So this is far more. And I think it's crazy at this stage to see this as a war against Hamas, and certainly not as the way to get the hostages back. And here, most of the hostage families themselves have voted with their feet in the protests that they regularly conduct. But you do have an Israeli plan for the day after, for many in the cabinet. The plan is the permanent displacement of the Palestinian population, the resettlement of Gaza. You have an administrative unit established in the defense ministry in Israel for what they call the voluntary transfer of Gazans. There's nothing voluntary when you've just destroyed their entire possibility of a reasonable livelihood. At the same time, we see the plans for the day after being put into effect in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, where you don't have Hamas in charge. The West Bank is the people who many Palestinians see as having gone so far to please their occupier, who do security collaboration with Israel every day. When Israel isn't arresting Palestinians, the authority in the West Bank is. And yet what do they get in return? More land confiscation, more forcible displacement, more settlement, more closures, more threats, if not promises, of annexation. And Israel also, in that coalition, has a view for the day after in the region, which I won't dwell on. But I think it's important to acknowledge that this is part of a bigger project of regional domination via unchallenged military supremacy. I sometimes call it a hegemonic project. I struggle with that word, though, because it implies at least some capacity for offering a soft power project that people could come under the wing of, which Israel is not offering. So that's where we are. There are, of course, other views in Israel. There is a group that at this stage, I think it would be accurate to call them dissidents, who recognize the crimes being committed, are deeply uncomfortable with those crimes, protest against those crimes, sometimes are arrested when holding up pictures of Palestinian starving children, or holding up pictures with the names of Palestinians that Israel has killed. And then you have this amorphous, what should, to be honest, what should be the place that the views that Ehud Olmert espouses today occupies, that offers an actual alternative, but it's not there. When, in July of last year, the Israeli Knesset voted on whether there could be a Palestinian state, it was a gratuitous declarative bill introduced by the Prime Minister. Not one Zionist member of Knesset voted in favor of a Palestinian state, voted against the resolution that said there could be no Palestinian state. Not one Zionist member of Knesset. This year in August, when a bill, again, gratuitous, declarative, was introduced to annex so-called Judea and Samaria, only the 4 members from the old Labour Party, now Democrats, voted against. That, unfortunately, is the reality of Israeli politics. Is there some kind of untapped possibility that Israelis, if we get to a day after, a cohort, 25, 30%, maybe plus, say, you know what, this really isn't working. And they look at what has gone on and they feel a sense of shame and they get that this isn't going well. Does that exist? I think possibly. And I think part of the disconnect between what we'd like to believe is a different day in Israel, is an alternative. The disconnect between that and what we actually have, not entirely, but in significant measure, is where the rest of the world comes in, and especially Israel's Western allies. Of course, primus inter pares is the US, but it's not just the US. Israel embeds itself in a Western system. And the message it has received from that Western system for decades is this is okay. The practical reality has been impunity. There is no cost or consequence, not prior to October 7th, for making impossible 2 states and for illegal actions, and not subsequently for the war crimes committed. And the cherry on the icing of that cake, I guess, was the Abraham Normalization Accords. That was the moment when Prime Minister Netanyahu, I don't want to speak to the intentionalities of the countries who went down that path. I want to speak to the reality of how that played out inside the Israeli public debate. And that was the moment Netanyahu could turn around and say, we are done here. The Arabs also don't give a damn. And I don't think you're going to get a different conversation in Israel unless and until Israelis begin to see that the era of impunity and complicity has drawn to a close. And I take no pleasure or joy in saying that that is the path that you have to go down if you want to see different outcomes. I don't believe sanctions can bludgeon countries into doing somersaults. What they can do in certain instances, and it hasn't been tried with Israel, is to free up the space for a different public debate and to end this exceptionalism. And
I'd like to hold you there.
Great.
You'll have an opportunity to continue to engage the others. And thank you for those important comments. And I'd really like now to turn to Sheikh Nawaf Al-Thani, who's already known to this audience. He spoke so eloquently this morning, and we're pleased to have you back again.
Please don't adjust your screens. Yes, I'm back. Unfortunately, my colleague couldn't make it, so I was asked to take his place. So I will not let you suffer more my voice. Just a few comments, and I'm sure like everyone else, we want to hear Muhammad and what he has to add, I'm sure, of more value. But for a couple of minutes, the question of the day after, which is the name of this panel, I think for me and for many that I've interacted with in the past now almost 2 years, the day after is a humanitarian crisis like we've never seen. I think what most people mean when they talk about the day after is the day after the day after, which is a peace process, security sector reform, rights, democracy, freedoms. That comes in the day after the day after. But the day after is a horrific scene that, unfortunately, if and when this war ends, we will have to endure together. And I think that opens a few questions, really, for me. In a panel, and I'm not sure if Muhammad was there a while back, a colleague of mine, an Israeli, was mentioning about the population of Israel and the disdain the majority of Israelis have for this war. And I told him something. I said, as a Muslim telling a Jew, what I'm about to tell you may sound weird, but the Israeli population have a come to Jesus time soon, because many a time in history, many a time throughout hundreds of years and thousands of years, the excuse of we knew but we didn't do anything because we didn't really know. We knew but we couldn't do anything because we couldn't. We knew, but that was the reality of what the extent we could do, was never accepted in history and was never considered as an excuse about atrocities. And as the only democracy in the Middle East, at least I'm told until recently it was, Israel should really, through its population, should take responsibility for their own future by making sure their own government represents what we were being told is their true intent. I think giving that voice a platform should be the future, because knowing that this is what should be done and yet unfortunately has no effect is really disappointing for us all. But finally, I would say that it also comes down to the issue of history, looking at all of this, because if and when this, which I view as many do as a genocide, is happening in Gaza, continues, and if it ends, then unfortunately that same historical reference I made about Israeli population, who apparently the majority are against this, do not act in a timely manner. As Winston Churchill once said, history will sound its deathly verdict too late. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Our last speaker on this panel is Mohammed Shahada. I know many of you already know him. He's currently a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations.
Thanks so much, David. Is this working? Yep, it is. I'd just like to start by saying there's plenty of space right here if you want to move from the back. Otherwise, I'm talking to an empty void. Yesterday, I want to apologize. Over dinner, my brain was shut down because of the jet lag. I didn't get any sleep, so I was rambling incoherently. I'm happy to report I got 4 hours of sleep. I'm still jet lagged, so I will still ramble incoherently. But thanks so much, Eunice and Fiona and Muhammad and the organizers here for getting us. And very happy to see Daniel, my good friend. They actually lured me into coming here with a promise of seeing Daniel here, my friend and mentor. And then he didn't show up. So they lured me with a promise of being with Nawaf, also another good friend of mine. So I'm happy to be at the same panel. Okay, I like scenario building, which is what David asked me to try to focus on. I'll try to focus on that, between the ideal and the most likely. The ideal, I'll start with a strange comment. So I was recently at a conference with Tamar Zandberg, the Israeli politician from Meretz, the very left-wing party. And she said something that was sort of remarkable but weird. She said on the day of October 7th, when she saw the Hamas attack unfolding, she said this brings us closer to the two-state solution. And it sounded paradoxical. But I heard exactly the same thing from Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, who said that the purpose of the October 7th attack and the hostage-taking by Hamas is to actually force Israel to end the occupation, not river to the sea, but he particularly said in a podcast to get us to leave Jerusalem, the West Bank, they're in the occupation, remove the blockade. And the third Israeli politician, so now I'm covering the full spectrum, he is called Almog Cohen from Ben Gvir's far-right party, a member of Knesset. And Almog Cohen said on the Knesset podium that the Iron Dome that protects Israel from Hamas rockets has been, quote, the worst curse on Israel in its history, because it allowed Israel to pretend that Palestinians don't exist, the conflict does not exist, and they can sleep soundly next to it. So these three people from different backgrounds, it's a little sort of source of optimism. The problem is that the two others, Gallant and Cohen, are drawing the different conclusion that the Israeli mainstream is drawing at the moment. That, okay, containing Palestinians doesn't work. Minimizing, shrinking the conflict doesn't work. Pacification, it didn't work. It exploded in our face. The alternative is a military option to get rid of the Palestinian question once and for all, to finish off the Palestinian question. So that's why Israeli friends of mine would say that Israel is currently in a mood of annihilation. The word that ticks the most, I read Israeli newspapers every day, twice a day, 16 of them. It's a stupid, painful routine because of the boredom, having to read the same stuff over and over. And the word that I see repeated over and over is lahashmid, to annihilate. I have an American friend that went to visit Gaza during the ceasefire. He said two things. Number one, there was this thick stench of death and gunpowder everywhere. Basically, 15,000 bodies stuck under the rubble. You know they're there, you cannot get them out, and the smell is everywhere. It's like when you walk on the streets of Gaza, it's like walking on the moon, because there's this thick layer of gunpowder and destroyed buildings turned into powder, basically. So there's this thick gray layer on top of the sand and the pavements and the streets. And the second thing is he went to meet soldiers and Israeli officers in the buffer zones inside Gaza, what Israel calls extermination zones. So he went to meet them there, and he said the soldiers, there was no soul behind their eyes. The word that got them to most excited was lahashmid, to annihilate. They wanted to go back into Gaza and finish the job, burn everything down. So that's the mood that Israel is into. But the good news is once you get them to realize there is no military option against Palestinians, then you get closer to the two states. The other good news, ideally, is that currently every single Palestinian political party, including Hamas, has endorsed the two-state solution. So Hamas on October 7th, they thought that they can provoke what is called the multi-front war, getting Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, different countries or different populations in those countries to overwhelm Israel. They imagined that there would be millions of people swarming into Israel, non-violently or rioting or etc., alongside an attack from Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and that would bring the Israelis down. But they realized this multi-front war doesn't work. So that's how exactly they realized the two-state solution is inescapable. With the ideal scenario, you would see Israel realizing, okay, annihilation doesn't work, containing Palestinians doesn't work, occupation ending is the only way. And I think occupation is too mild of a word. Even apartheid doesn't capture it. Like the closest thing that comes to mind is a military dictatorship, North Korea style. For example, I'm from Gaza. I've never been to the West Bank, not a single time in my life. Neither did my father or my grandfather before him. Not a single member of my family has been to the West Bank. Although I have some friends, colleagues, and even relatives in there. I have family outside of Gaza, exiled around the world. I even have an uncle, my mother's brother, lives in Canada. I've never met him in my life. I've never met any of those family members in my life. And that's only one aspect of it, the separation under this North Korea-style dictatorship. The other aspect is basically, if I write a post on Facebook, then the IDF would come and kidnap me overnight. Even if I don't write a Facebook post, there's this Israeli routine called making your presence felt. So, for example, I have a friend, Yehuda Shaul, the founder of Breaking the Silence. He said in Hebron they had a routine. Every day you pick up a house at random, you storm in, you turn everything upside down, you take someone, kidnap them for 2-3 days to make your presence felt. And if anybody thinks that this is a recipe to make Palestinians into Gandhis and peace activists, I don't think so. So it's imperative that this should end. The other ideal thing is the siege on Gaza, draconian, suffocating siege, should end as well. I mentioned yesterday, I've lived a cursed life. Everyone around the table yesterday was bragging about achievements, about how fancy titles they have. I have some stuff to brag about, but it's irrelevant. Like much of my life is just a permanent state of non-life in Gaza. Like literally 2/3 of my life is basically siege punctuated by periodic military massacres. The closest story that would sum up this is my closest friend in Gaza, Ali Adam. He was killed in January last year in an airstrike at a hospital. His head was decapitated in the strike. The only footage I have of him, because he never liked to take pictures, so the only footage I have of him is his lifeless body being carried to the hospital. And Ali, his story is the most Gazan story I've ever seen, because his entire life for the last 2 decades was basically a pure life of shame. His entire being is shame. Every day he woke up out of bed to eat breakfast with his family, he did so with his head down. Every time he walked outside the house, the neighbors would ask, what are you up to? There's nothing going on in his life. His head is down. Every time he asked his parents for pocket money to get a snack or a haircut, his head is down. Because people in Gaza before October 7th would reach the age of 37, highly educated, very impressive resumes. My English, for example, is self-taught. I've never been to any school. And I'm very mediocre compared to other Gazans. Like I have friends who speak multiple languages in there, programmers, etc. And you have a very long CV with educational achievements, but zero work experience. So 37 without being able to afford to fall in love, to start a life, to move out of your parents' home, to start a family, to put food on the table, to have purpose. And the thought that crossed the minds of literally everyone I know in Gaza is suicide. Gaza is a religiously conservative society, culturally. There's the belief that suicide is a gateway to hell. But you still had every year about 600 attempted suicides that we know of. A lot of them are not even reported. So you see, we got to a place where people believe that God's hell, no matter how terrifying it is, it's much better than the hell that Gaza has been turned into. And with Ali, the worst day in his life, the worst day in the year, was basically his birthday. It's a reminder his life is languishing before his eyes and he's never got a chance to live it. And that's the most painful thing about his death, is that he literally never got a chance to experience life. Life in Gaza was basically just pacing the parameters of the siege, and not even. You would lose track of the days. All days of the month are the same. You wouldn't know which day of the week it is because you have no job, you have no life, you have nothing going on. And if that sounds like, again, a recipe to create a Gandhi, I don't think so. That's why you had Ehud Barak and Ami Alon, I think, the former head of Shin Bet, both of them saying explicitly that if they were in Gaza, they would have joined Hamas. I'm more of a statistical error. Like I have sort of a genetic disorder where I'm genetically a pacifist. My father was a medical doctor who hated the sight of blood. He couldn't stand it. It was paradoxical, so he had to work in administration. And I think I inherited those genes. But basically, for anyone in Gaza, like even in the West Bank, I think Palestinians are some of the most self-restrained people on the face of the earth. And I don't say this polemically. Like imagine your life in the West Bank. Like one of the most terrifying thoughts I have about the genocide in Gaza right now is not just the destruction of all of it, but to find Israeli settlers moving into the area where my father's body is buried and digging the graves out, dumping the bodies into the garbage, and building a life there. And you see them smiling, smirking, laughing, dancing, partying in your face. That would drive me insane. Just the mere thought of it. In the West Bank, they call that Tuesday. It happens every day. And you don't see people rising up enough to fight back, although that would have been the logical conclusion. Like in Europe, you see an immense satisfaction, an immense delight amongst Europeans every time a Russian soldier is killed. And the New York Times legitimized it, they justified it. They said, well, because subconsciously, every time you see a Russian soldier killed, you feel safer about your life. This is someone that would have killed you or your loved ones. But when it comes to Palestinians, it's another category. Then there's the other element that I think would be ideal is Hamas either gone or integrated politically. And integrated politically might sound shocking, but you have to remember, Israel had 2 prime ministers that were terrorists on wanted lists, international wanted lists, Shamir and Begin. Begin was even called a Hitleristic type by Israel's founding father, David Ben-Gurion. His party, Herut, which turned into Likud, Netanyahu's Likud, was called by Einstein as Nazi. And Begin became a Nobel Peace Prize winner. So it's not a far-fetched idea. You don't make peace with friends, you don't make peace with like-minded partners, but with adversaries. You have a very authoritative study by the RAND Corporation. It's called How Terrorist Groups End. It's in 2008. They studied about 268 terrorist organizations from 1968 to 2008. They found that only 7% were defeated militarily, whereas 43% were dismantled through a political process, negotiations. It's the way you have it in Colombia, the way you had it in Northern Ireland, the way you have it in most other conflicts that ended in an ugly way. Now for the most likely, not the ideal. The most likely, I'll be brief, and I'll try to be optimistic and depressing at the same time. So with the optimistic stuff, Hamas has ceased to be a threat to Israel at all. They have no will or no capacity to threaten Israel for the next at least 2 decades to come in Gaza. I'm happy to qualify that statement after, but I'm trying to be succinct. But the idea of Hamas doing another October 7th, like the strongest thing about October 7th was the element of surprise, Israel being caught with their pants down. If you think that the IDF is that incompetent that they would be caught by surprise again, then it's more of their problem than Hamas's. Like 9/11, when 9/11 happened, did you ever hear US politicians saying, if we don't wipe out Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, then another 9/11 would happen? Absolutely not, because it's intuitive that the US is perfectly capable of preventing another 9/11 attack, just like Israel is. If Israel had 10 more helicopters on the borders on October 7th, it wouldn't have happened. But at the same time, so Hamas is no longer a threat. They've run out of rockets. They don't have the popular sort of incubator. They don't have the will. There are Hamas leaders that are saying if the war ends today, not a single person would think about firing a single bullet on Israel. You saw it during the ceasefire. There was concern in Hamas that either their own members or other political militant groups like Katab Mujahideen, Islamic Jihad, others would try to kidnap Israeli soldiers during the ceasefire, or try to kill Israeli soldiers, or would even kill Israeli hostages. They would try to sabotage it, or if they get provoked by the IDF, they might retaliate. And then the ceasefire goes into effect. Israel kills 155 people during the ceasefire itself, over 42 days. And not a single bullet was fired from Gaza. So armed resistance, Hamas being a threat, is not a case anymore. At the same time, there's a very solid capacity for Hamas to sustain a long-term insurgency in Gaza for as long as it takes. 5 years minimum. It can take way longer than this. Because it doesn't take much to sustain an insurgency. All it takes is anti-tank missiles, which Hamas can produce easily by recycling 15,000 tons of unexploding Israeli bombs, and an infinite recruitment pool created by the genocide. Everybody in Gaza understands this is a war against us, not against Hamas. The difference between life and death in Gaza is very arbitrary. Like in previous wars, the goal, as stated by the UN, was to, quote, punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population in Gaza. But nonetheless, you knew some things that you can do to increase your chances of survival. Go run in a hospital. Stay around journalists, run into a UN facility, run into a school, run into an open park. Nowadays, if you do any of these things, you become a target. Like with my friend Ali, if he had just stayed home 1 minute more, if he had hugged his mom before he left, he would have still been alive today. Like simple decisions. Do I eat breakfast now or after I go for a walk? Do I say hi to my neighbor or keep going? These can make a difference between life and death. And that sustains the insurgency indefinitely because it's an infinite recruitment pool. Hamas, whatever amount of militants they lost, they've recruited twice as much. Now the depressing part, as Daniel said, Netanyahu's 5 parameters for ending the genocide basically state very clearly that they would continue the genocide. He doesn't have a day after plan because he doesn't want Gaza to have a day after. He doesn't want Gaza to exist anymore. Just as simple. So he's saying even if Hamas disarms, releases all hostages, leaves Gaza, Gaza is demilitarized, the IDF would stay there. A single Israeli soldier staying into Gaza, do you know what that means? The modus operandi that the IDF deploys in Gaza is our soldiers' lives come before the civilian population's lives. What that means, if there is a single soldier, let's say in this building, The area around it with a radius of 2 kilometers is marked by the IDF as, quote, an extermination zone, that any civilian that walks into it would be neutralized immediately. That's what it means to have soldiers in there. I'll finish with 2 sentences. The thing that Netanyahu is trying to do now, Gaza City, annihilating the largest remaining urban space in Gaza. Like now Rafah, Khan Yunis, Jabalia, Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, all of them have been flattened completely. Gaza City is the largest remaining urban space. Aerial bombardment alone cannot annihilate a city. That's why they're moving ahead with a ground invasion, because you need to move in with bulldozers, with mines, with these armored personnel carriers that they turn into giant bombs. They fill it to the brim with explosive material, robotize it, send it into populated neighborhoods, detonate. That's how you annihilate a city. And the second thing that Netanyahu is working on is the ISIS-linked gangs in Rafah, Abu Shabab, a drug dealer, a warlord with connections to ISIS. His 2 deputies are ISIS members. One of them was responsible for the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit, Ghassan Adhani. He was known to Israeli intelligence agencies because he used to fire rockets on Israel. And Netanyahu created for them a concentration camp in Rafah, in the southeast of Rafah, in an area called El Shoka, on the borders with Egypt, to push the entire population there. And it's very clear. I asked Egyptian officials, what would you do in the scenario of Israel blowing up a hole in the fence and pushing people out? The Egyptians said, this is a declaration of war, we would react forcefully. And then I asked, okay, what if Israel just pushes people there and creates the conditions remotely for people on their own, without the presence of a single IDF soldier, to open a hole in the fence and run in there? What would you do? And they said, our soldiers have instructions to stand down in that scenario. They wouldn't kill people trying to flee on their own. And that's what Netanyahu is trying to create. The last thing I want to say is the path forward takes a form of not talking about disarmament, but decommissioning. Disarmament means surrender. You wouldn't get Hamas to surrender. Decommissioning, it means gradual process with a political pathway on the side of it, Northern Ireland, and create dilemmas to the Israelis. They're not facing any. Like, what brought the Palestinians to accept the 2-state solution was not the moral appeal of it. It was being told explicitly, if you go against the 2-state solution, the entire world will crush you with the weight of the international community. In Israel, what pushed them to the Oslo Accords is that, in part, the first Intifada, in part because in the 90s, Israelis couldn't get Pepsi Cola in there. They couldn't get Toyota vehicles. There was this Arab boycott that turned Israel into a pariah. And without creating these dilemmas, it doesn't work. And the last recommendation is stop humiliating or allowing the humiliation of Palestinian moderates. Like I say to Israelis all the time, you make it impossible for us to be moderate. Because if I stand up and condemn the killing of civilians and condemn the killing of, condemn October 7th and condemn Hamas and declare my love for Netanyahu and basically hang up a portrait of him and worship it on camera, first of all, I would get 0 traction from Israel. I would get 0 traction from Europeans. I would get 0 traction from the Canadians or the US. Nothing. I wouldn't have a single good thing to show for it. Like, I spent a decade in what is called the peace industry, writing articles in Haaretz, in the Jewish Daily Forward, engaging in this track 2, track 1, track 1.5. I have nothing good to show for it. Like right now, my family is on the street in Gaza City. I was talking to a cousin in his 40s, and he looked like my grandfather right before he died at the age of 107, a total skeleton. He looked like a meth addict. And they're literally sleeping on the street. And all the connections in Israel, all the connections in Europe, all the connections here and there, all the dialogues, I couldn't get them a single tent, not one tent. I couldn't get them a single bag of wheat flour or any food whatsoever. And I couldn't get any of them out. I had a friend studying quantum physics in Sweden, so prestigious thing as a PhD, and then he calls and says, our house was bombed, my brother was killed, my 2 other brothers, one of them is critically wounded, the other is about to lose his limbs, his legs. And he says, I beg you, you get to pick and choose. Which of them can you save? Which of them can you get out? And I try, and I try, and I try, and I call here and there. I couldn't get them out. It was literally my moment to shine, to show him that talking to the Israelis pays off, talking to the Westerners pays off, talking to white people pays off. And then I just looked like a piece of shit. And it's not only that we have nothing good to show for being moderate, we're constantly demonized, called terrorists in suits, no matter what we do. So stop that, because if we are gone, if people like Samer and I are gone, the next people you would have to talk to would be Fathi Hamad, the Hamas leader who's saying kill Jews all over. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. Those are both insightful and passionate remarks. And what I'd like to do in the remaining time is I'd just like to cycle back through because Grace and Daniel have been listening, as has Sheikh Nawaf. And I'll invite you each to spend a minute or two if there's something in particular you wanted to raise, and then invite a few questions from the floor. Grace?
Yeah, thank you. A lot to cover, and of course, difficult to listen to, but very important. So thank you for those remarks. I just want to follow up on a couple of things that Mohammed brought up, which is the threat of Hamas. I agree with everything that he said. Hamas has not been a threat, a military threat to Israel in a long time. There are different estimates out there about when Hamas ceased to be a threat, but they go back at least a year, if not a year and a half. In terms of the RAND report, it's an important report for people who are thinking about so-called terrorist groups. And, Mohammed kind of got into the ideology thing, but there's other kind of qualitative and quantitative aspects to consider when we think about, dismantling terrorist groups, which has been the public objective put forward by Netanyahu. The first is the length of time that terrorist groups exist. Once they pass a certain threshold, it's very unlikely that you're going to dismantle them militarily. The other thing has to do with leadership. As with, established terrorist groups, like Hamas, there are leaders that can take over, and that's something we've seen. And then the most important thing is probably ideology, what Mohammed mentioned. If there's nothing given in the absence, and this is actually mentioned by Israeli IDF soldiers, if you only need one person with an RPG and no other opportunity to continue a guerrilla fight, which is what we're seeing today. So there is no strategic objective, let's be very clear on that, on the military offensive that's happening right now in Gaza. And there hasn't been for a long time. It is about sustaining warfare for political means. So I think that's an important thing to note here. The other thing I'll just comment on, I agree with Mohammed, the way forward is decommissioning and eventually, and this is very controversial, but a political integration. And there is in the Middle East enough precedent for this to happen. In fact, when Rabin and Arafat shook hands on the White House lawns, they were both, Arafat had been considered a terrorist. Rabin was part of a Jewish Zionist paramilitary organization prior to the establishment of the state. We see it consistently. Al-Shara is now the president or the interim president of Syria. So we need to think a little bit more creative when we're talking about the future of Hamas. Now, again, this is when we get into the theoretical. I think, what has also been outlined in the comments here is that the reality is likely not going to be this. It's going to be a further worsening of the humanitarian situation, potential public annexation of the West Bank, in addition to, and which is already a de facto annexation. And this one thing that really resonated with me is you're right. The day after, it's the day after the day after. The current focus should really be on Gaza, and that's where I think the efforts and international efforts should lie. And I'll just leave it there because we're almost running out of time. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Daniel, 1 minute.
So I do think it's crucial to think about this renewal of Palestinian politics. I'm here in New York. Abbas wasn't allowed to speak. His speech probably got more attention as a consequence of that, wasn't allowed to come. He doesn't represent the Palestinians. He hasn't held this together. He's been absent during this time. That's not a personal criticism. That is a structural reality of Palestinian politics today. And this question of including not just Hamas, but of actually having a representative, strategic Palestinian leadership. When I say that, not so that they will say yes to everything America and Israel says, in fact, so that they can articulate a more effective challenge and carry others with them. That is hugely important. And anyone who says, how could you involve Hamas after this? Well, I've got a news for you. No Palestinian is enthusiastic about sitting with the genocidal Israelis after what has been done. But that's what it will have to happen. And what strikes me from all of this is that we are in a zero-sum place. And we have to get beyond that. And getting beyond that means acknowledging that in this space, there will be Palestinians who must have their rights fully respected, and there will be Jewish Israelis. I personally am not convinced that that is going to be achievable through partition. Israel has created one political space. Gaza has now been obliterated. I think we have to be far broader in scoping the possibilities, but the options cannot be genocide or apartheid. The options have to be legitimate fulfillment of both people's rights in one state or in two states. And the last thing I will say is, you know, what hasn't come up in this conversation is recognition. I think, or at least almost not at all. And Canada is also recognized. And I think that's because recognition feels like such a woefully inadequate, borderline irrelevant act in this current moment. I would happily park that and move to the things that may actually shift the Israeli public debate.
Sheikh Nawaf.
Understanding that we mentioned Netanyahu today a lot and his tyrannical attitudes towards running this crisis, and cognizant of another tyrant, which is the clock, I'll try to keep this in a form of a question that could be answered by anyone on the stage later on or anyone up here, which is something I'm asked a lot by my Israeli friends when I speak on different conferences and closed meetings because of Qatar's role in mediation. Why don't you go beyond the government and speak to the population? Why not speak to the Israelis directly? Why not advertise? I don't know how that even could be done. But that is a question I have. Can the Israeli population be, we heard from the Prime Minister that hundreds of thousands a week come out to protest. So how can we reach and have that dialogue with the population that peace, the pursuit of peace, should be the end state that would benefit us all and not a continuation of war? And with that, thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm going to, in the minute or so we have left, and I apologize, I thought that you would want to hear from the speakers, so I let them go longer than we had asked, and that's my fault. But I will invite, if there's a question or two, if the question is brief and to the point, because I know we have the Turkish ambassador who will be here soon. Please, and make sure you introduce yourselves, for those who don't know who you are.
Samer Sinijlawi, I'm a politician from Jerusalem. I have a question for Daniel and one for Muhammad. Daniel, since you are in New York, there was this letter signed by President Abbas to Macron and MBS and Trump, where he committed in paragraph 4, page 4, for a presidential and legislative elections within 1 year from the date of letter, 9 of June. And then surprisingly, the statement of the co-chairs of the summit in New York stated that there should be a Palestinian election 1 year after the ceasefire in Gaza. Why do the world keep giving a pass for Abbas at the age of 90, where he has done business with 8 Israeli prime ministers, 6 presidents in USA, did not succeed. He's at 80 and they say it's still too early for him to leave. Let's keep supporting him. Even when they try to support the Palestinian people in recognition of their state, they become more and more hypocritic to understand their needs in democracy, in real democracy. Palestinian state cannot survive if it is only demilitarized. It should be triple D, demilitarized, democratic, and developed. And he cannot deliver any of these 3 Ds. This is my question. Do you have an understanding? You have been there in New York. Muhammad, what's our plan? Okay, you have described in a very emotional way, and I think you touched the hearts of a lot of people. 5 points plan. What can we do as Palestinians? We should have a plan.
Please.
Good afternoon, and thank you. My name is Timea Spitka. I'm from Carleton University. Thank you so much for this sobering panel, and thank you especially to Mohammed. I think I wanted to give you a standing ovation afterwards, but I was... my question is about mediation, and we have the Qatari representative here, and I mean, I come from background of mediation, both from Bosnia case and to anybody that knows anything about mediation, this is like, in terms of representation, it's non-existent, right? Of who's in the room. I mean, and I think this brings it back to the point that Mohammed was making is that there's a humiliation of the moderate Palestinians, and they're not sitting behind the table. And neither is civil society, neither is the opposition, neither are women. So I mean, and I think you're in expect anything from Israel is I think useless. So it has to, international community needs to be behind some kind of effort here to put an end to this. So I'm just wondering about potential for mediation, more sides.
Okay. With the indulgence of the ambassador who's just arrived, I invite a very quick response to those questions, and then I think we'll call it a close.
Thank you. For the mediation question, well, first of all, I'm not a representative of Qatar, but I happen to be Qatari. The role of Qatar's mediation in this instant is not to mediate a universal solution for the Palestinian rights. It's a very narrow role to mediate the release of hostage, the ceasefire, the humanitarian aid to protect the civilians, and hopefully move to the second phase where the end of war happens. And that was successful when both sides wanted to work. But you need two to tango. Mediators are not negotiators. That's different. The mediator can provide the atmosphere, the incentives, the points of, smoothing out the points of differences, but there is a limitation to what a mediator can do. And hopefully, Qatar or others would be asked one day to mediate for a full peace plan, although there are several in the grand menu of options for a two-state solution. I think we should all agree on one and just move forward. But thank you for that question.
Mohammed, very briefly, just...
Well, I'm speaking tomorrow again with Samir and Daniel, so maybe I'll save some of it for tomorrow.
Please.
To be brief, like a Palestinian plan, you already have one with, for example, an offer of decommissioning Hamas. What that means is Hamas now ran out of rockets. Well, all you need to do is to get an Arab force to go into Gaza and collect the unexploded ordnance, which is Hamas's main source of recycling into new rockets. Then you get that Hamas is no longer threatening Israel with rockets. What do you do with Hamas's anti-tank missiles and Kalashnikovs? Hamas offered them to put it in a depot in Gaza with civil society as a guarantor, or Arab countries as a guarantor. This is what the IRA did in Northern Ireland. Like the Good Friday Agreement, it was not immediate demilitarization of the IRA. They basically put it in depots. And by 2001, they said, okay, the British government is not complying with our agreement, so therefore we're not going to destroy our weapons. And then civil society had to step in. In that sense, the weapons are not used. They're in a depot. But they are your insurance card that an agreement would be fulfilled to the end of it. And then the other element of the plan is a technocratic government in Gaza, not Hamas and not Fatah, something that Hamas accepted, Fatah accepted as well. Abu Mazen is tiptoeing around it, but with a little bit of convincing and forcing, they would get there. The Palestinian Authority eventually coming in, but I think the strongest element of a Palestinian plan is to get Marwan Barghouti out. And it's not because of his pure genius or extraordinary intellect, I don't think so, but because he has been constructed as a hero, as a prototypical member of a group. Once you have a member that is constructed as prototypical of a member of a group, in group theory, that member can tell the entire population, move right, most of them would move right, move left, most of them would do so. For example, if I tell Palestinians killing Israeli civilians is wrong, a lot of them would be like, why are you sucking up to Israel so hard when Israel has killed 10,000 times more civilians than we did? But when Marwan Barghouti did it on camera, and I showed it to focus groups, there's not a single one dissenting. Everyone agrees, Marwan says killing civilians is wrong, so it must be true. And you're already having him committing to all of these things. And he's the perfect counterweight to Hamas in the PLO or in elections. He's polling ahead of every single Hamas leader in any poll whatsoever, with a wide margin. And the last thing is, when Abu Mazen eventually is not around, I don't think he's going to die, Samir, but I think he's going to be like ascended to heaven Jesus style, where when he's not around us, Israel would need a stabilizing force in its own interest, and they will not find anyone except for Marwan. So they would release him eventually. It's inevitable, because I don't think Hussein al-Sheikh is a stabilizing force. Like the New York Times wrote an article, this is the future leader of the Palestinians. Nobody likes him. That was literally the verbatim article of our vice president. So Israel would eventually release him. But if he's released with Israeli, European, Canadian, American pressure, that would destroy his credibility amongst Palestinians. But if he's released now in a ceasefire deal, that would maintain his credibility. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'd like to thank all the panelists and all of you for being so attentive, with apologies that more of you didn't have the opportunity to ask your questions. And the one thing I'd say that I'm sorry about is that we didn't have a strong member of Israeli civil society with you on this panel who could have engaged you, and you engaged them, and be part of this very important discussion, perhaps next year. So thanks so much, and I think there's a very brief break.